bonjour tout le monde, ou en France, no, wait, did I have that right? Bon après-midi tout le monde, mais en France, bonsoir. I almost got it right. I'm so, Martin, the time zones are the most confusing part of doing Zooms.
Hello, Barbara. How good to see you again.
Well, it's lovely to see you too, and in your wonderful ancient farmhouse.
Ah, yes, it's an ancient farmhouse that has a wonderful merit of 2 foot thick stone walls. So indoors, it's much cooler than the heat wave outside. We hit 103 degrees today, which is almost unheard of here in France, and we're all sort of mumbling about global warming. We're mourning over our gardens. We've got limits on the amount of hose pipe we can use. It's just like being in Arizona.
It's cooler here in Arizona. I know, it's just wonderful. We're under 100 degrees and it's been raining. So I've really kind of enjoyed our European Zooms in the sense that we can claim the higher ground for once.
You certainly can. We're not nearly as well equipped as you guys are. There's no air conditioning or hardly any in France. I'm counting on my stone walls to protect me.
Well, good luck to you. You always, well, you may have more water. So we're here to talk about To Kill a Troubadour, which is another wonderful investigation and adventure for Bruno Courage, chief of police of Saint Denis and
Right.
possibly of the Vézère Valley, whose remit keeps expanding. And I think it's because, Martin, in part, you just can't let go of your life as a journalist and interest in international affairs. So you have to like drag them to Saint Denis.
I don't drag them. I mean, what you have to bear in mind is that when I first began writing about Islamic terrorism, this was when France had just been hit with a massive terrorist attack, which had killed hundreds of people in the Bataclan nightclub. And when I'm now writing a bit more about Russian affairs, we're all seeing our electricity and our gas bills going through the roof because of Putin and Ukraine. And as you know, Barbara, I've been sort of bringing in the Russian element into my books for some time because I spent, as you know, 4 years in Moscow as a foreign correspondent. So those of us who knew something about Russia were not at all surprised by the outbreak of this Ukraine war, by Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And indeed, I'd brought up this theme of Ukraine-Russian tensions before in my novels. So I try and combine this glorious little haven of the Perigord with the real world. And the real world is upon us. And what's happening to the gas bills and electricity bills across Europe is just shattering. It's people are going from thinking of paying. I mean, my gas bill has gone from around about 1,000, 1,200 bucks a year to more like 5 to 6,000. Thank you, Mr. Putin. Um, it's something that all of a sudden we're realizing that whether we're living in the USA or in Europe, um, these international affairs can hit us hard at home as well. And that is something that I've been very aware of here and something I try and bring into my novels.
And you do it very well. Daniel Silva forever has kept Russia as like the main antagonist for the West in his Gabriel Allon novels. And
Yeah.
interestingly, in the new one, Portrait of an Unknown Woman, he's abandons spying and sent Gabriel back to Venice to get himself involved in art forgery and an international art market. And I think in part, although I haven't talked to Daniel about it because I was away when he was here at the store, I think a part of it may be that it's just so hard to keep up when you're trying to write right on the current edge of events,
Yeah.
but the necessary gap between writing a book and publishing a book can
Yeah.
in fact send a book out of date if you're too
Yeah.
specific about it. So I found that really fascinating. The
Well,
other
I was
thing,
accused. You remember the book that came out last year, The Coldest Case, in which I had a forest fire menacing a wonderful old chateau. I was accused in one of the, in a kind way, I was accused in one of the French newspapers of clairvoyance, because this year we've had a whole range of forest fires coming, and I can say, well, it was clear that climate change was going to do this to us. But it's really been striking the way that people in here in rural France, 500 kilometers from Paris, are feeling connected, affected, disturbed by international affairs in a way that is really quite new for this part of France. And I think that's probably something that's hitting large parts of America as well, given what's happening to gasoline prices and other energy prices. It's becoming a tricky kind of world.
Well, it is. And in fact, I flagged a note that you made at the end of your first chapter when you say the world, Bruno thought, was becoming dangerous again.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
thinking, that we have had, except, I mean, there have been isolated wars in the Mideast. We've had Iraq, we've had Afghanistan. But in general, the world has been at peace for quite a long time. And now, of
yeah.
course, we may be looking at civil war here in the United States, which is just insanity prevailing. And so, I don't know. It feels like the 1930s all over again.
Well, I mean, sitting here I mean, as you know, I was reporting for many years from Washington. I know a lot of the characters involved, but I even had lunch with Donald Trump once. But I never got a word in edgeways, by the way. Um, but America seems to many people here in Europe to be going through a particularly rough time at the moment.
Well, we
And
are. No,
but
it is.
to hear you use the terms impending civil war is very sobering for me.
Well, there's a whole neo-fascist thing going on, but I'm a child of the 40s and 50s, and I remember McCarthy in the McCarthy era, and I feel like we're back in it all over again. But what I do know, which gives me some hope, is that whenever you have a period of this kind of extreme with so much anger and all, most people just want to get on with their lives. And
Sure.
and after a while, everybody gets tired of it. They're just exhausted with it all. Trump is exhausting. I mean, he's just completely exhausting. And at some
Yeah.
point, people, want to have a more normal course of life and all. So I don't, I mean, I'm just not going to get into it, but I
Yeah.
do
But
think
I,
in
Barbara,
time, in time it will peter out.
I always take comfort from something that Winston Churchill once said, which is that you can always count upon the Americans to do the right thing once they have exhausted every conceivable alternative.
Well, I can't really argue with that, but we're not here to talk about American politics, God knows. And we're not actually talking French politics. What we're really talking about in To Kill a Troubadour is a Russian disinformation campaign designed to destabilize the EU by creating a rift between France and Spain. And to do that, Martin does a wonderful job in reminding us of the Aquitaine. And Martin, I don't think I ever realized how far north it went. I never really thought about Bordeaux and the Garonne as being kind of the northwest boundary of the Aquitaine. I tended to think of it as much more confined to southern France and the Pyrenees. And in fact, you take us over to a river in Spain to
Yeah,
remind us, that it isn't just the northern boundary, but the western boundary that was
absolutely.
probably wider than most of us think of.
Well, a lot of the energy that's in this book comes from my growing appreciation of the degree to which the Perigord, as a part of Aquitaine, is part of a region that is older than France. I mean, France really begins with Clovis, the first king of the France, but there was a culture here long before that. And what's more, the Occitan language, the local language, which is very like Catalan in northern Spain, and a lot of my neighbors still speak it as their first language. They have it on their telephone answering machines. And having got to know some of these people who are very much involved in the Occitan language and publishing books in Occitan and poetry in Occitan, I got to know a wonderful guy, Jacques Bonlon, who is uh, a musician, a songwriter, a poet, and he has been very much instrumental in forming a number of rock groups, folk groups, which are modernizing the old troubadour songs. And the more I got into this, the more I thought, I mean, I got history degrees. I thought I knew about history. What I hadn't realized was just how important this whole tradition of culture that came from the Moors in Spain, across the Pyrenees into Aquitaine, and how much that has helped create modern European culture. Most of our musical instruments came from the Moors,
Was.
the rebec, the lute, and so on. Much of our poetic rhythm came from them. The form of poetry came from them. And I was delighted to find that the son of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard Lionheart, the famous English king, his native language, his mother tongue, was Occitan. He wrote poetry in Occitan. And his famous poem, Now I in Prison Lie, was actually recorded about 10 years ago by Brian Ferry, singing the words in the original Occitan. I mean, the idea that this ancient tongue, this ancient culture is still here is extraordinary. And the more I learned about the way this tradition of the troubadours um, really helped to create modern European culture. For example, it was Eleanor of Aquitaine, this wonderful woman, the only woman to have married a king of France, then a king of England, the only woman who got to Jerusalem on crusade. And there's a wonderful account in one of the monks' versions when they were traveling through Turkey, this column of Eleanor and her husband driving through the hostile Muslims, constantly being attacked. Every time the morale of the troops began to falter, Eleanor would rip off her blouse and ride bare breasted along the line of the troops to get them really feeling energized again. What an extraordinary woman.
Sure.
And she grew up in a castle where, with her grandfather, Duke William of Aquitaine. And Duke William had been a prisoner of the Moors for a while when he was on crusade in Spain. And so he'd learned Arabic. He'd learned about the troubadours and songs and music. And he had a number of Arab prisoners of war who were being held for ransom while Eleanor was growing up. And she learned about music and a bit of Arabic from them. And then she marries King Henry of England, and uh, his court is enthused by the first accounts of King Arthur, of the Knights of the Round Table. But the Round Table came from another poet whom Eleanor brought into the story. So this extraordinary tale of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, which is one of the core cultural memories of most of Anglo-American European history, it comes from Eleanor. And it goes all the way to, for example, it goes all the way to Wagner, whose Parsifal opera comes directly from this story. Chrétien de Troyes was the guy, one of the poets whom Eleanor supported, who lived at the court of her daughter. He was the one who brought in the idea of the Round Table. He brought in Sir Galahad and Sir Lancelot. I mean, without Eleanor, we'd have had a rather boring, dreary little tale of a Welsh king. But she added something extraordinary to it all and created something that still lives on in our culture today with great power. So I the more I got to learn about this, the more enthusiastic I became. And you know how I get bees in my bonnet about
Yeah.
things. And so I wanted to write a novel that would bring all this in. And of course, the great sort of crisis of Catalan independence was underway, and I was learning more and more about Russian subterfuge and Russian cyber warfare efforts taking place, which happened against Europe in your election in 2016. And it happened in our British Brexit referendum in 2016. We now know a lot about who these people were. We even know the address where this cyber warfare group is based. We know some of the participants. And I got fascinated when I realized that I actually had been at the funeral of one of the key figures because I was in Moscow when Kim Philby, the famous spy
Yeah.
who was working for the Soviets, became deputy head of British intelligence, but he was a Soviet spy. When he died in Moscow, and this was in 1988, I went to the funeral. I went to the gravestone to see him buried. And a Russian friend of mine said, you know, there's another big funeral taking place. And I went along, and it was the funeral of a woman called Africa de los Reyes. And Africa was a bourgeois woman, a well-to-do family, who joined the Communist Party on the eve of the Spanish Civil War, worked for the communists, was escorted back to Russia by the NKVD, the old KGB, where she became the head of the Spanish language operation for the NKVD. During World War II, she was running the radio links and connections for the partisans who were attacking the División Azul, which was the blue division of about 12,000 Spanish volunteers who were fighting for the Nazis on the Eastern Front. After that, she was sent to South America, where she became the first person to alert Moscow to the coming invasion of the Bay of Pigs in '61 against Cuba. She was instrumental in some of the intelligence operations in Cuba around the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then she was back in Moscow again running the Spanish service, by which time it was much bigger with South America and Cuba and so on. She had a daughter called Africa who went into the same business. But anyway, I was there. I went to her funeral. I saw her buried, and I saw the headstone going up that said she was a polkovnik. She was a colonel of the KGB when she died. And here is a woman. What a trajectory! What a journey! And how much of modern history is there? So I wanted to bring something about her in as well. And so here I have Russians, Spanish traditions, Catalans, troubadours. I was just sort of, I was, I was just like I can't tell you, I was as happy as a sandboy playing around with all of this sort of stuff.
Well, I can tell. And yet you started out very interestingly because you started out with JJ, who is Bruno's superior, so to speak. Let me think. I'm trying to remember. You give him his exact title here, which I have already
He's the chief
forgotten.
of detectives for the département.
That's right.
Jean-Jacques, yeah, Jean-Jacques Géricault.
Commissaire Jean-Jacques, right.
Yeah,
Anyway, he comes to Bruno because they have found a bullet or at least a shell in a car, right? That has had, I'm trying to remember, was it some kind of anyway, they can't
it's
work out, it was a car accident or something terrible, but in the wreckage, they found this bullet. And
yeah.
JJ thinks that Bruno, who won the Croix de Guerre, must know everything there is to know about like ordnance and weapons. So
Well,
he
the
comes
car
to,
had been stolen on the Spanish border
is that
and had crashed, apparently a crash with a deer, and they found this unusually large shell
right?
in the back of the car. And Bruno says, well, it's a 12.7 millimeter, which is an American .5 inch. And it's normally used in heavy machine guns for anti-aircraft fire. But in recent years, it's become used more and more by very specialist snipers. Now, about 10 years ago, to be able to kill somebody at 1,000 yards was quite special. These days, the record is over 4,000 yards because they're using this heavy shell. And the current record is held by a Canadian sharpshooter in Afghanistan, who managed to have a kill shot at over about 4,200 yards. And so Bruno says, well, either we have got a very, very sophisticated hunter who's looking for elephants, which he won't find in the Dordogne, or we might have a sniper on our hands. And using a bullet like this, he's a really skillful sniper. And at that point, alarms start to go off. And the next morning, Bruno hears on the radio news that the Spanish government has banned a song called A Song for Catalonia, which is performed in Catalan, in French, and in Spanish. And it has been recorded by friends of Bruno's, the Troubadours, who are a group modernizing the old medieval music. And Bruno usually has them every year at the concerts he organizes on the riverfront in Saint Denis. And Bruno suddenly thinks, uh-oh, Spanish car, Spanish bullet, troubadours, Catalans, we could have a problem here. And off we go. That's
Indeed.
all in the first two chapters.
I know. No, it really gets off with a rousing, but we don't overlook the usual pleasures of life with Bruno in Saint Denis. He's still cooking. He's still riding his horse. His
Yeah,
Balzac, his wonderful dog, his basset hound is still there. He has a
And he's not
monitor.
just, it's not just Balzac the Basset Hound, it's Balzac's babies,
Yeah,
because Balzac had his first
litter.
conjugal experience
Oh, right.
in the last novel. So now it's time that the puppies are born, and a couple of them are there in Saint Denis, owned by friends of Bruno. And so Balzac is now on occasion wandering through the town of Saint Denis with his daughter or his son by his side.
I love it. You're setting things up because when we lost Bruno's first dog, that was really tragic. In fact, we
Gigi,
talked
yeah.
about that Gigi, you didn't want Gigi just waste away and die of, old age as
No,
dogs unfortunately
I
do.
was
So you gave
well,
Gigi a heroic death.
I had this memory in my mind of Oscar Wilde's comments upon Charles Dickens's novel about Little Nell, when he said, only a heart of stone could forbear to laugh at the endless, agonizing tragedy of the death of Little Nell, which goes on for about 40 pages in Dickens. And I thought, well, I really cannot have this dog who's getting on in years dying of old age in Bruno's arms. I mean, that would just be very difficult to write. So I thought, well, maybe he dies on the field of honor, protecting the life of his master and attacking the guy who wants to shoot him. And that I thought was a fitting, heroic end for this splendid dog. And I mean,
Well, it
I
was,
have,
it
huh?
was very hard to read. But then, of
Well,
course,
I
we
know
couldn't have
it's hard
Bruno.
to write. I
Yeah.
had tears in my eyes when I was writing it, but I get very involved in these things.
Yes, you do. But anyway, we couldn't have a dogless Bruno, so Balzac was next. But now you've carefully set up yet a new generation from Balzac and his lady friend. You actually wrote a very romantic encounter between Balzac and I can't remember the name of the lady Bassett Hound.
Diane de Poitiers.
That's it.
Diane de
Very
Poitiers,
fancy.
named the mistress of a French king.
Yep. And they had a lovely courtship and a wedding night, all that good stuff. And now we have
Yeah,
puppies, as we point out, but we still have Hector,
the horse.
Bruno's horse, and Pamela's still in the picture. And in fact, they have a one night stand in this book, which is sort of a surprise. But I guess Bruno can't do totally without some sort of sexual
Well, I
moment.
mean, it was a tennis tournament. They
Right.
were the mixed doubles. They were playing some semi-professionals, and Pamela sort of won the game on her own, and she made it very clear to Bruno as they were celebrating their victory that she wanted him in her bedroom very quickly.
Yes.
So Bruno, being the perfect gentleman, I mean, how can you say no to a lady?
That's very true, but you wanted to be sure that they weren't starting up what was going to be basically a dead end romance. But the one thing that I do quarrel with you about is Isabel. I'm really tired of Isabel. I think that Bruno should look closer to home. It
Well,
just
I
seems
mean, in
terrible
the
that he
novel I'm
doesn't have
writing
a
at the
family.
moment, which will come out next, the novel I'm writing at the moment, which will come out next year, um, it becomes quite a testing moment for Bruno, because, of course, in this novel, there is another woman who starts really appearing strongly in the scene, which is Florence,
Right.
the science teacher, because her ex-husband returns, having been in prison. And Bruno hadn't known he was in prison. Bruno hadn't known the background story to it all. And this becomes a sort of a sidebar drama to the whole of the Spanish, Catalan, Russian cyber warfare business. But I'm quite proud of the research I managed to get in about the particular addresses and titles and names and so on of the various groups of Russian intelligence operatives who were at work. And it wasn't easy to get some of this stuff. So some of my old contacts sort of came through with help. But I can stand by everything I write about these various units of this address in Khimki, just outside Moscow, where they're running this operation.
Going back to Florence, and point out that she's been there for a little while. And not only is Florence appealing, but what's really appealing are her children, because Bruno, who is now, what, 40 some, really would like a family. And, so there's a kind of ready-made family there. So I'm not writing these books. I'm just pointing out that I think it was very nice of Bruno to have
You
Florence
are
and the children instead of Isabel, whose career
you
clearly matters the most to her. Her principal allegiance is to her very exciting career. And, more power to her. I mean, nothing wrong with that at all. But I just, but she's useful. And she's particularly useful when you're bringing the outside world closer
yeah,
to Saint Denis, because it gives
absolutely.
Bruno a contact within, departments of French security and all, that on his
Yeah,
own he might not really have. And one of the things
yeah,
I love about Bruno is his organizational ability. He is able to pull together like the whole department, um, as he does, in fact, in this book. And it's based on a web of personal relationships and so forth that he has, and I think you do a wonderful job. And because he's not just a village policeman, he has a much broader, he has a much broader authority, whether it's formal or informal, and part of it's just based on the people that he works with. Also the mayor, because truly the mayor of Saint Denis is one of the great continuing characters in these stories. And he's a
I have
born
great fun with the
politician.
man.
Oh, he's
Yeah,
great. He really is, but he also has a lot of contacts. And I guess we haven't really mentioned, for those who don't know French geography, that the Périgord, the Dordogne, really is kind of in the heart of France.
it
It's
is.
not Paris, which is
Yeah,
north, but it's in the heart. And Martin, I think it's Saint Emilio. I'm trying to remember, but the first time I came to Bordeaux and went to live in the Dordogne for a few weeks, in a home of an author that I was working with, I'm pretty sure it was Saint Emilio. And isn't there like a underground,
church,
yeah,
underground
but it's
church in San
it's
Emilio.
even
Yeah,
more than that. It's kind of almost like a little cave system or something.
yeah,
But in it, the whole 100-year war between France and England is vividly alive. I mean, it
yeah.
was like in the 1300s, and it's still there in Saint Emilio. It's still there in paint. It's still there in story, and people still talk about it.
Well, I mean, the thing is that the Périgord and the southwest of France is older than France itself. France begins with Clovis, the king of the Franks in the 6th century. But there was a tribal system, a tribal capital of the Petrocores, the people around Périgord, long before that. I mean, we had cathedrals and so on here in the Périgord before Clovis was even heard of, and the language of this area, Occitan, um, and my neighbors still speak it, is it's older than French. So the in French you talk about the two language of groups. There is the land of oui and the land of oc. And oui is the northern France, where oui is yes, and that's divided by the River Loire. And south of the Loire is the land of oc, which is the local term for saying yes. And basically from south of Orleans all the way down to the Spanish frontier, down into Provence, the Italian frontier. That's the Occitan area. And it's the way in which Paris exerted its authority over the rest of France, including Occitanie, was pretty brutal,
Yeah, I'll say.
uh, particularly in the Périgord area, because this part of France was the home of the two great heresies, the Cathars in the
Yeah.
13th century and Protestantism in the 16th century. And those two religious wars were extremely bitter. We reckon that in the wars of religion of the 16th century, Catholics versus Huguenots, Protestants, something like 2 million French people died, which is more than 10% of the population. And it's something that's still very bitter. We have in my village here, we have a Place du Temple, Temple being the term for a Protestant church. The church was demolished by King Louis XIV in the 17th century. It's still called the Place du Temple. Its history is very near where I live, and not just French history, but prehistoric times as well. We've got a walk from my house is the oldest known grave in the world, 73,000 years old, where there are 8 people buried. And I mean, this sense of deep history, prehistory, is extremely strong here. This Valley of the Vézère holds more archaeological sites, more of the old painted caves, and over 100 of the decorated caves, and 25 of them are painted, more than anywhere else in the world. Most of what we know of prehistory comes from walking distance from my house.
Indeed, it does. I have been there many times, and one of the things I've always thought was partly anyway. The reason is that the geology, the limestone, and the fact that water was able to wash out and create these caves in which the Neanderthal and later other prehistoric people could live, and the climate was reasonably benign, is a big reason. Certainly, you have one of the great archaeological museums ever right around the corner from you, and you have staged more than one scene in Bruno novels. In fact, there.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the prehistory is with us all the time, and we fall over it when the rains come. You can walk through fields here, and you're likely to stumble over a prehistoric flint scraper or a hand axe or something. It's somehow always with us. And every year I go to Lascaux as a kind of pilgrimage, this great masterpiece of the painted caves, and I just adore it. I'm still marveling at what I'm learning about it all. I mean, one thing that really, really struck me was that only about 3 years ago, the archaeologists learned that they could use they could use a kind of a laser investigation to check the plaque on the teeth of prehistoric skulls, which meant that they could start to work out what their diet really was. And we now know they weren't dining off mammoth legs all the time. They weren't this so-called Paleolithic diet that people were making fashionable some years ago is bunk. An awful lot of the time they were eating vegetables. And one of the main vegetables they were eating was duckweed from the rivers. And this struck me very hard because with my wife, with Julia, when we were traveling through Southeast Asia, we were in Luang Prabang on the Mekong, where they have this annual river festival. And one of the salads we were served was made of duckweed or riverweed. And here we are in the 21st century eating this riverweed. And then I learned, my God, prehistoric people were eating this same stuff. It's mind-boggling. It really is.
I'm sure they were pulling fish out of the river Vézère. And in fact, one of the things I really love, across from the museum, there's a restaurant that I think is made out of an old mill. But anyway, there must be this dish is confit de canard, or preserved duck leg.
It's called the Hostellerie du Passeur. And it's
right. And I've been there several times, and I have never failed to order confit de canard, which is one of my very favorite foods. But I'm sure that the ancient people, they pulled fish out of the rivers. They probably captured a few birds. I don't think there were a lot of hairy mammoths wandering around in the Vézère Valley.
We now there is a theory that some of the mysterious signs in Lascaux, which look like fences, were in fact the kind of traps they used in the river to catch fish, to catch trout.
Okay, that makes perfectly good sense.
They would dig these rows of stakes in and then splash to force the fish into this trap where they would then catch them, which makes a lot of sense.
It does make a lot of sense. And let's go back to Bruno and point out that one of the real joys of reading the books is that Bruno is a locavore. He grows things in his garden. When he's constantly having feasts or he's taking food to feed whatever he's doing, a lot of it is that he has grown it himself. He makes his own venison pate. He makes his own walnut wine or brandy. In fact, he offers JJ a glass of it because JJ is coming so late that coffee doesn't seem appropriate. And in fact, there is a route des Noirs that goes through this area because it is so famous for walnuts, and you can buy them in Sala de Canada, where they have a terrific market on Saturdays, and I don't remember,
Well,
is it Tuesdays, something like
I
that.
mean, what I'm writing about here is what I know because I make my own walnut wine.
Well,
And
and
before
Bruno too. Come on, talk about your Cuvée Bruno.
this is how I learned about it from Pierrot, who was the original inspiration for it all. And I mean, we live off our garden throughout the summer. It's been a bit tough this year because
Yeah.
with the heat and the lack of water and so on, it's been problematic. But still, my tomatoes are great. My potatoes, my new potatoes are fine. My cucumbers have turned a bit yellow, but I can still make them into a gazpacho. So it's, I mean, I never thought while I was working in journalism and in think tanks and so on that I would finish up living like a French peasant. But it's it's very pleasant.
I think I told you that when we were, I can't remember the name of the village now, but when Rob and I were living there for 6 months, or 6 weeks, I made the acquaintance of a farmer because I was taking a walk down the hill towards the valley, and a couple of his sheep had gotten away from him and he was running, but he was handicapped because he had fallen into farm machinery in a truly awful event. And so he was very crippled. It was hard for him to move. So I, having been to Yorkshire and observed how this was done, threw myself after the sheep and wrestled the sheep to the ground. And therefore the farmer and I made friends, and his wife, and he invited Rob and myself to come for Sunday lunch. They speaking not one word of English and we having pretty rudimentary French. But what this man had was a pear orchard. And he was, I didn't know it until afterward, renowned in the village for his incredible pear brandy, but he would never share it with anybody. And at the lunch, he gave us a bottle of pear brandy, whereupon the entire village was consumed with envy, because we walked back down the street carrying the bottle of pear brandy and so forth. And I thought that we would be wrestled to the ground, but and it was amazing stuff. So I'm pretty sure Van de Noix would also be. But what's going on? One of the things that you also have going in Saint Denis is that you have a kind of a community vineyard going on, in which Bruno and some other members of the community, they are shareholders, right? It's a little for-profit kind of operation, and Bruno serves a lot of the local wines at his meals and so forth. But did you decide to make Cuvée Bruno after you wrote that, or did you decide you were going to make wine and then you decided to write it into the books?
No, what happened was that because of the impact of the Bruno books on tourism coming to the Périgord, because tourism has just taken off in a big way, particularly with Dutch and Germans and people who were not originally coming very often. I was made ambassador of the Périgord. That I was elected to be a grand consul of the wines of Bergerac, which is a body that was founded in the year 1254 by an English king, Henry III. And so since I'm the first Scotsman in 700 years to be a grand consul, I took it seriously. And I write for a local newspaper every month a column about the wines of Bergerac. And I now have visited most of the vineyards. I know lots of winemakers. I love what they do. And I got into making, with a friend of mine, Julien Montfort, who has his own vineyard, we got into making the Cuvée Bruno. And I also got into making Van de Noix. And I mean, basically, I've gone native, Barbara.
You have it. More than that, you really like swishing around in your robes of office. It has a hat, it has a cap, and it has these gorgeous robes.
We had a big anniversary recently for the Vine de Bergerac, and all of the consuls in their robes. We had to parade. We began with a church service at 9 a.m, and then we had to parade through Bergerac to go to a vin d'honneur, and then to a very splendid lunch. And I was the only grand consul who was not wearing the robes of office. I decided to wear my kilt and my Scottish regalia.
That's what caught everybody's eye. I love it. But
most of the photographs were taken not of the consuls, but of this weird Scotsman and this man wearing a skirt.
Did you wear a Scottish cap? Because I thought the great part of your robes of office
I
was
wore
that
I
sort of
wore yeah
medieval
not
flat
a tam
cap.
o' shanter. I wore a Glengarry, which is a rather thinner one.
Right.
But I had my sporran in, which was made of badger skin and badger fur, and
Well, you're going to have to write some of that into one of the books. Now, this book, I'm happy to say at the beginning, Martin has taken a few lines, 246, actually, somebody had written a poem in Occitan, and then he translates it into English so that you can read it. If you speak French at all, you can pretty much make some sense out of the
yeah. Well,
Occitan.
I wrote it in English, and I got my neighbor to put it into
Oh, is that
Occitan.
how it worked? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well, they will never destroy all our poetry. They will never silence our songs, which is great. So back to the plot, which we've kind of hedged around about, but we do have a group, the Troubadours, and it's clear that jeopardy is about to surround them. And they're at the center of this disinformation campaign, which I find is really interesting that that you brought the Catalonian thing in, to this part of France, even though it's rather remote, without taking a firm position about whether you think that Catalonian separatism is a good or a bad thing. I mean, I have been to Barcelona many times, and there's a lot of pros and cons among the Barcelonians. Not all of them are in favor of separatism, but a lot of them are. It reminded me, Martin, of a period, and I'm trying to remember when it was, but let's say it was around the turn of the 21st century, when Quebec and French-speaking Canada was absolutely determined, it was going to split off from Canada. And it just went on, and there were lots of extremists, and it almost came to a vote, and then it's died away. Because
there were two referenda, and the separatists lost each one.
Right.
But it's also very live for Scotland at the moment.
I know.
Scotland had a referendum, and there was only a minority voted for independence. But the Scottish National Party very much wants to have another referendum and very much wants to.
Well, after Brexit, I can blame them, which, has been I really enjoyed reading that, and finally Boris Johnson had to go, that the headlines here were that the British are tired of having an entertainer as their lead politician, and if only America could wake up and do the same thing. Because I mean, but the parallels are amazing. But I thought about that, that if I were Scottish and I had this clown in London who, as a ticket to get into office, decided to embrace a perfectly ridiculous position, why wouldn't I want to split off? And it'll be interesting to see, now that Johnson's gone, whether you all will rethink Brexit.
I mean,
I'm not asking you to comment, I'm just mentioning it.
I think, like many Scots, I feel there's a kind of a tension between my heart and my head. Yeah. Your heart will say, yes, Scotland, a nation again. But your head says, well, we can't live on exporting whiskey.
No.
And North Sea oil is just about run out, and North Sea gas. So given that Scotland, given that the British Treasury pays more per head to the Scots than it does to the English, what's the future going to be if we're not there anymore? And a lot of people in the nationalist group will tell you, oh, we'll join Europe. Spain will veto it because of their fears for a precedent that could include Catalonia.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky time. But equally, I think that we've all been made to think about things much more seriously in terms of international politics because of Ukraine, because of the war.
Well, and not just about politics, Martin, but I think, COVID pointed out to us the weakness in having these very long supply chains, because they just fractured when stuff was going on. I mean, I ordered something off an Instagram post that I think was a pair of shoes, but I mean, it was nothing, but a small thing. And time went on and time went on and time went on. And I thought, well, it's never going to happen. And then I got an email one day saying, your merchandise has reached the port of Shanghai. And I thought, seriously, I mean, no kidding.
Yeah,
But what I also think is going to happen is that this war is going to force Europe and into alternate forms of energy. Oil and gas are not forever. They're cheap, but
yeah,
they're not cheap, we're going to have to be looking at other sources of energy. I think the water crisis here in the United States, and particularly for the Colorado River compact states, of which
yeah.
Arizona is one, the only state that has a decent alternative to Colorado River water is California, and
Mm,
because it could desalinate. I mean, the
yeah,
entire island of Aruba, which I used to go to as part of the Virginia Bar Jollies, is entirely desalination, fueled
mhm,
by energy that comes from oil refinery from Venezuela or Colombia, I can't
yeah,
remember which. But in any case, California can desalinate and we can't. It's just
yeah.
prohibitive. But as the cost of, the cheap stuff begins to rise, I think people are
Well,
going to have to look at it. They're going to look at desalination. We're going to have to look at more solar, more, air, wind power, all that.
well, we've learned that here in France because for years the French were saying, "Oh well, we get 75% of our electricity from our nuclear power stations." Well, this summer, because the rivers are so low, there's not enough water to cool the nuclear power
Right.
stations. So more than half of the French nuclear power stations are currently being repaired or being asleep. France is importing power from England, which are England and Scotland and Britain, which is coming from wind power in the North Sea. I mean,
Right.
Britain's now more dependent upon wind power than anywhere else in the world, and the wind keeps on blowing.
It does
So
keep on blowing. I
it's
remember
the new
going to
world.
Liverpool a few years ago and watching, the dynamos coming up the
Yeah.
river towards Liverpool. Listen, we ought to bring Ian into this conversation to see if there's anybody. We have not really talked a lot about the plot because unfortunately, if we do, we're going to completely give it away. So let me say that all the standard Bruno things that you love, the food and the animals and the villagers and all of that are here, overlaid with this really interesting story about whether there's a real threat directed at the Catalonian, the troubadours who are doing the Catalonian thing, or whether the whole thing is just misinformation. And of course, this being Martin, there's always a giant action blow up scene at the end of the book, which resolves it, but we can't tell you what actually happens, but it's pretty exciting. Right. So Ian,
Well, you know me, I like to end with a bang.
absolutely. Why not? I mean, so it's sort of quasi village mystery thriller. It's
Yeah,
just, there's no real way to describe Martin's books. They are
yeah.
uniquely their own. Ian, are there any questions or anything?
Yes, there's a few here. I think it was back when you were discussing maybe the Occitan language,
Uh-huh.
and somebody asked, can we hear an example of that language?
Ooh,
Yes, I will read you an example of it. And my accent is not
Scottish.
as good as it might be, I fear, but mai no esparan tots els nostres poemes, mai van essenciar les nostres cançons, mai poden erradicar tota una cultura. E nostres somnis de troubadours són massa forts, un poble que canta és un poble que viu, e un poble viu mai mor. Which I will translate. They will never destroy all our poetry. They will never silence our songs. They can never wipe out our whole culture. The troubadour's dreams are too strong. A culture that sings is the people who live, and the people who live cannot die.
Very
Baba!
nice.
Bravo.
Bravo.
Another person asks, is the title of your book inspired by To Kill a Mockingbird?
No. Well, I suppose it was. There must have been an echo in my mind for To Kill a Mockingbird. But I mean, the plot is really about the attempts by people to silence this particular troubadour and to kill him. So it just sort of fell into place. But I read To Kill a Mockingbird many years ago, and I remember seeing the movie. It must be 30 years ago or so now. So doubtless that echo was there in my head and came through. But There's no lawyers in this particular novel, I should say.
No, but it has a very nice rhythm. And also, I should point out that the troubadours were really the repositories of culture. Their songs, as they moved around and they sang,
Yeah,
carried culture and carried history from one part of the world to another.
absolutely.
And especially in a pre-literate age, which to a great degree this was.
Yeah.
It was like Homer to the Greeks, the
Well,
troubadours.
they were the after dinner entertainment for the kings and lords and feudal masters, because you can't just sit there, gnawing away at your chicken legs. After you've eaten, you want some entertainment, and so that was the troubadour's job. And they sang and they recited poetry, and it was of huge importance because, for example, King Henry II of England, who married Eleanor of Aquitaine, his eldest son, rebelled against him. And one of the guys who rebelled with him was a Perigord man, Bertrand de Born, who was himself a troubadour as well as a noted warrior and knight. And Henry II's son dies of, we think, tuberculosis when the rebellion is already failing. So Bertrand de Born is arrested and is hauled before King Henry II to answer for his crime of rebellion against the crown. And Henry II says, well, do you have anything to say for yourself? And Bertrand de Born says, no, but I would like to sing a plan. I would like to give you a song I have written about my love for your son and my loyalty to him. And he delivers this poem. And at the end of it, Henry II is weeping. And he says, for the love you bore my son, I give you your life and I restore your lands to you. And we find Bertrand de Born again in Dante, in the Divine Comedy, because as you're going down from purgatory into the Inferno, who is the guy who is holding the torch, which is shining from his head beneath his arm? Bertrand de Born. And the main school, the main lycée in Perigord, is named after Bertrand de Born. These things are still with us here.
And a final question, who is publishing your book?
Well, in the USA, it's Knopf. Always I'm published by Knopf. And in Britain, it's Quercus Books. But we've now just got the 19th language for Bruno, which is Bulgarian. So on top of all the others and the Japanese and the Korean and the Turkish and so on, we've now got Bulgarian. It's a language, one of the few languages I couldn't begin to make out, but there we are. It's
Well, it's Slavic, sort of Slavic, I think. I've been to Bulgaria, but I don't remember conversing with anybody. I forgot to do the commercial part and tell you that because Martin is not in Scottsdale, Sab, but in France, he has sent us yet another recipe from Bruno that is not in the book. There it is. Thank you. And his publisher sent us this marvelous photo of him, with a market garden basket and so forth. So each one of our books comes to you with a recipe you can't find elsewhere and the photo. And I should end by asking you, Martin, where are we with the cookbook, which has been published in German forever, but hopefully is finally coming to America from Knopf, your publisher.
It is. It was meant to be coming out this September, but as you know, there have been these huge paper shortages in the USA, because this novel was meant to be published in May, but it had to be delayed. So the cookbook is coming out next fall in English, Bruno's cookbook, and it's it won the prize as world's best French cookbook when it first appeared. So I hope it does well here.
Don't you love it? I mean, two Scots have written, Martin and his wife Julia, who's a noted chef and a very lovely person.
Couldn't make it up, could you?
So two Scots have created the world's best French cookbook. Gotta love it. Anyway, thank you, Martin. It's been wonderful to see you. We still have, we have an unlimited number of copies of the book, and we can always make more cards if we need to. So, and Ian, who, for those who have not met him, is in fact the person who processes our internet mail orders and so forth. So he's the guy that you want.
Thank you, Ian. Barbara, lovely to talk to you. It's just a tragedy we cannot go off and have our usual dinner afterwards.
Well, it's not my fault. I was planning on
I
you
know.
being here, but you
I
know,
wish I were. I wish I were with you.
well, we'll try for maybe better things next year. We
We'll
should
hope next year.
certainly get you here for the cookbook.
Yeah, you bet.
We will do it. All right. Good night, or once again,
Good night.
au
Au
revoir,
revoir.
everybody.
Big hugs.
All
Ciao.
right. Bye. Thank
Bye
you.
bye. Thank you.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.